Christopher Hitchens, what is your view about the American literary community's response to the death warrant issued by the Ayatollah against the author of Satanic Verses, Salman Rushdie?
Well, tomorrow is the birthday of George Washington. And tomorrow, the shopping malls of the United States, which contain now 1/3 of the book outlets in this country, will of their own volition not sell that book because they're scared of a foreign despot. Now, in my opinion, for that to happen in this country on Washington's birthday, to be scared of a crazy foreign tyrant in this way is a really serious challenge to what we think of as the safe assumption of free speech and free inquiry, free expression, and the necessity to defend it. And in a way, though I find all this very depressing, I welcome it because maybe we need every generation or so to remind ourselves that it's not a free ride to have free expression, not a free ride to have a free society, and that it does need to be defended. But this has got off to a very bad start, very bad start.
Christopher Hitchens is our guest. Our phone lines are open. The subject is how America and the world literary community, including publishers, is responding to the Salman Rushdie situation. The phone lines are open. You can begin dialing now. We'll spend a few more minutes with our guest, and then we'll open the phones to you. Area code 202-628-2525 is the number for those of you living and calling from the Eastern and Central time zones. Those living and calling from the Mountain and Pacific time zones, 202-783-2727. Those outside the United States, dial the appropriate country code, and then 202-737-6734 is the number for you. There's a story in the Washington Post on Saturday, this past weekend, headlined, "Silence in the Eye of the Rushdie Storm. Fear has swept the North American literary and publishing establishment in the wake of Ayatollah Khomeini's death sentence on novelist Salman Rushdie, author of the Satanic Verses." Even talked about Canada barring importation of the books. Do you want to characterize any of that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I know that a lot of people who will, in the ordinary way, when it's some imprisoned Czechoslovakian playwright like Václav Havel, who's actually on trial this week, or someone in Chile or South Africa or Poland, will, automatically sign. There's a list, everyone sort of knows it, people you can call, famous American writers who will put their names to a defense of the freedom of others not so fortunate. In this case, some of these people decided to pass. And some of them, one of them is quoted in that story, said it was because they were frightened. And for me, the most depressing moment of reading that story was when Arthur Miller said that. I mean, Arthur Miller was a hero to many of us when we were young, before we were writers, because of his tremendous bravery in the face of the McCarthy hearings, and the play that he wrote, and the plays and books that he's written on the theme of free expression. That he should say that he is scared to associate with a protest where a writer's life has been directly threatened, and where his books are being burned, and the threat is that he will be burned too, it just makes me very sad. Now, the same justification I don't think applies to bookstores like B. Dalton and Walden Books, who've pulled the book from their shelves, deprived Americans of the chance to read the book for themselves. That's a merely commercial consideration. They haven't been threatened. They aren't. No one's asked to go on TV and show their face and say, give the Ayatollah the lie and say, all right, I don't care what you think. I prefer to exercise my rights. And then we have, sorry to drone on, Bruce, but just one final thing before we say. I think it's been very sad that the religious leaders of the country have been so feeble. They've all either said nothing, or, as in the case of Cardinal Archbishop O'Connor of New York, have said they think the book is blasphemous. And they've, as it were, directed their criticism at their book, instead of calling the Ayatollah Khomeini a blasphemer for using religion to mount a contract killing, which is what he's publicly done. So that's my take, since you asked.
All right, and we've got you here in part because you wrote this column that appeared in the Friday edition of the New York Times, Now Who Will Speak for Rushdie? What's the reaction you've gotten to this column?
Well, nice of you to ask. I mean, it shouldn't be me who says, but actually the response was very positive. I think a lot of people have rung me from around the country saying it's what they wanted to read, which pleased me very much. I think, look, the piece is full of cliches. I say all the obvious stuff, all the things that we take in with our milk. Freedom of expression, freedom from fear, and so on. But there are certain days when cliches come alive, and I apparently was lucky to publish my cliches on Friday, because Friday last, because that was when people wanted to meet them.
Youngstown, Ohio. First call for Christopher Hitchens. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. I would like to address myself first of all. I am a Muslim, but I don't adhere to the Khomeini doctrine of Islam. My question is, even though I believe in the absolute freedom of expression by anybody, there is always a fine line where a sensible, intellectual, and educated person like Salman Rushdie should really recognize. Secondly, freedom of speech does not allow anybody to be also extremist to the extent that he insults 1 billion Muslims. The second comment, I would like to address the host of this program. I've been seeing this program for a long time and I admire it very much. But so far, every time there is an issue between Arab and Israelis or Muslim and non-Muslim, you never ever bring to your program anybody represent the other view. If there is really freedom of speech and you believe in it, you should adhere yourself to it and you should allow the other side to present their view. All your guests so far, they were representing the opposite view. Why don't you allow us? We are 8 million Muslims in America. We have a right to be represented in your program, and we have many Muslim scholars. They would like to present their view in your program.
All right, sir, thank you. I'll respond to that after we hear from Mr. Hitchens.
There's a mistake at the heart of what you say, sir. You say that though you are for free speech, you aren't for the exercise of free speech if it offends Muslims, and you say that that is the line that we draw. As a matter of fact, you're in error. The First Amendment to the Constitution allows anyone who wants to insult anyone they like in any way they choose. That includes belief in religion, which is especially given no particular protection by that amendment, which is in fact rightly described as the cornerstone of our liberty. Now, that's just the fact of the matter. I can say what I like about your religion, and you can say what you like about my humanism, and I will not attempt to prevent you from doing that. In fact, so far from that, I would defend anyone who tried to make you be silent. That is the foundation of what we call the Enlightenment. It's terrible to have to be saying this, because it's ABC, but there it is. Now, to your point about the insult, I have read the book, I don't know if you have, and I'm clear in my mind that no insult to the Prophet or to those who believe in the God of whom he's the messenger is intended. The words that are complained of are spoken by a sick man suffering from paranoid schizophrenia in a dream in which he believes himself to be the Archangel Gabriel, who is a Christian icon. So I think that's about as far fictionally as you could go to avoid the charge of blasphemy. But I must add that if Salman Rushdie had wished to be blasphemous, had wished to challenge the tenets of your faith, that would also be his right. So don't confuse me in giving you two answers. I mean them to be separate but related.
And to the caller, I would say that we make every effort here to have a balanced presentation of all issues. I'm certain, I know that we've had representatives from the Arab and the Muslim worlds, both paid lobbyists, as it were, and other journalists and the like. Perhaps you'd prefer to see a greater proportion than we've had on, or you've simply missed the ones that we've had on. In either case, I urge you to keep watching, and you will see over the course of time a balanced presentation on this and all the other issues that come up for discussion on this program. Tulsa, Oklahoma is next. Go ahead, please.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to know, why has it taken so long for the U.S. government to respond to Iran's statements of killing Rushdie, and what do you think the United States will do to Iran for this, if anything's going to be done?
Well, it certainly is true that the first statement made by Secretary of State Baker was fantastically weak. I mean, he said that he thought the murder threat was regrettable, which is, I don't see really that you could have chosen a more feeble word than that. President Bush today has, I think, said intolerable, which is an improvement, but not an enormous one. For the United States, there are two problems. One is you have no diplomats anymore in Iran, no one to withdraw, unlike the European countries. Unlike the European countries, you have no ministerial visits that you can cancel that are in preparation. Actually, things could barely be worse. Plus, there are American hostages in the custody of people supposedly pro-Iranian and probably pro-Khomeini. So that's all difficult. However, I do think that something a little more daring could have been said about the founding principles of the American Republic when they're attacked in this way. After all, damage has already been done. Salman Rushdie's had to cancel his trip to the United States. That's to say, Americans have already been robbed of the chance to meet him, see him for themselves, meet him at book signings and so on. Many Americans have been deprived by other Americans, American bookseller monopolies, of the right to buy the book. In other words, we're giving ground to the Ayatollah just at the point where his regime is crumbling, his revolution is at a dead end, his credibility is in shreds, even in his own country. At just this moment, it seems to me appalling that people should start crying out before they've been hurt and giving ground to what I described before and would describe again as a foreign despot.
We have half an hour left with Christopher Hitchens. Before the next call, let me ask you your response to this argument that those publishers who are withdrawing the books and those authors who might not be speaking out have, and that is, it's one thing to respond to another publisher who's banning a book or to a citizens group, but here we're dealing with a terrorist head of state. That justifies our action.
Well, I don't see where the distinction comes. I mean, the fact is that these struggles for freedom of expression, freedom of speech have always been indivisible, and they've often required a victory over fear. I mean, and they've often, I'm afraid to say, necessitated a confrontation with people who have deeply religious ideas. It was deeply religious people who didn't want the Bible translated into English and burned the first 2 or 3 translators, William Tyndale being the best known. Deeply religious people tried to prevent Galileo from pointing out that the Earth goes around the sun and not the other way around. Deeply religious people did it to Sir Thomas More. There are countless other cases. Unfortunately, if that is backed by state power, that only means it must be opposed that much more strongly and in a more unified way.
Wenatchee, Washington State. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I want to challenge this assertion that there should be no restrictions on free speech or on writing. I know the newsmen are all against any restrictions, but years ago I happened to be in New York, and Orson Welles had a radio program, and on this program he talked about an invasion by the Martians. Well, it created a panic in New York. All the telephones were tied up for hours. No ambulance or calls could go through. Lord knows how many people may have died just on account of that. Now, I want your guest to answer me if he believes that should be freedom.
Obviously, yes. The question answers itself. Orson Welles has the right to put on a play. People have the right to behave like fools and lemmings when they hear it.
You have the right to...
Actually, what that was a reaction to the very early days of radio, where there was still something quite mysterious about the wireless, and as the British used to call it, messages from the ether, and people weren't very familiar with it. It had nothing at all to do with the exercise of free speech, and I'm afraid to say banning Orson Welles to try to stop people being of a panicky disposition would be, well, it wouldn't even be putting the cart anywhere near the horse.
Wouldn't that be the equivalent, though, of yelling fire in a crowded theater, which is not a protected speech?
Yelling fire in a crowded theater is not an act of drama or literature or novelistic or any other kind of production.
Oklahoma City, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just wondered what the decision of Walden Books and B. Dalton says about the fact of, large corporations controlling distribution of literature in this country.
Well, I think it shows a generally depressing tendency towards monopoly, towards corporatization of the market, and towards standardization of the market, and towards the selling of books as if they were shoes or exercise manuals or videos or whatever. In a way, that's a good thing. I mean, it means that you can go to a mall and buy a book while you're thinking of buying something else, or other members of your family are doing other things. But it has led to a tremendously restrictive model for the outlet of books, and in return for books being marketed as commodities, they've also been put at the mercy of a very small number of distributors.
You're a rather high-profile person in your own right, a columnist for The Nation magazine, having written this column that appeared in the New York Times. Have you gotten any threats of any kind?
No, I haven't.
Do you expect any?
Well, I had to say to my wife, what about this? I've got to go on TV and do this and that. And what do you think? We have a child, and he goes to school in Washington. And I'm in the phone book, by the way, and think it's my right to be in the phone book. And she said no. She comes from a country where there was a dictatorship once. And people came to her house and pushed her around and so on. And the fact is, there's only one way you can respond to it. We've had braver friends than ourselves in the past in countries of persecution. And one's often wondered, well, what would it be like? Well, the fact is, this is not a fair test. All we have to do now is not abandon the principles we have anyway. Nothing heroic is demanded.
Newton, Massachusetts, go ahead, please.
Yes, hi, I'm a first-time caller and a reader of The Nation.
Hey.
And I wanted to, first of all, I'm an atheist, and I wanted to emphasize the fact that I have the right to ridicule anybody's religion, but I would absolutely fight for their right to believe it. And I wanted to get your views on Canada's these hate laws, because I believe they were put into place because of a person who wrote some garbage about the Holocaust not ever existing, and this is what happens when bad law goes into effect because of freedoms to say really lunacy. If somebody wants to publish it, I just thought I'd like to hear what you'd have to say on that.
Yeah, look, it's another of my famous cliches I was describing earlier. You know, they come alive at moments like this. You say freedom's indivisible. How many times have you heard that? Well, it turns out to be true. The law in Canada was indeed passed in order to protect the susceptibilities of Canadian Jews, and it was used to prosecute someone who wrote a very unpleasant pamphlet saying that the Holocaust had not taken place and was a Jewish fabrication. Actually, the guy went to jail. Now, a number of us at the time wondered if that was a proper use of laws governing speech, and I also wondered if it would stop there. And of course, it never does. You give the state a law like that, and what's it going to do but find it convenient? I come from a country that doesn't have a First Amendment, and I know how that works. Often I think Americans don't realize how lucky they are that they have a First Amendment that doesn't allow this. I should say, I'd like to add one thing to that if I could. Salman Rushdie, who is someone I know and admire, has in Britain stuck up consistently for the rights of the Muslim minority. He's defended also the rights of Muslim peoples overseas who he thinks have been carelessly disregarded or brutally treated by powerful Western countries. He's got a very good record on all this. It strikes me as particularly hateful that he should be the object of this murder campaign by a leader who claims to speak for Islam.
Thousand Oaks, California is next. Go ahead, please.
Hello. I was just wondering if you believe that the decision by the Ayatollah to go after Rushdie was like a blind grasp for a scapegoat, as in the case of a power or a regime that is losing power, in order to help them in world standing and to combine all their people for one purpose again.
Yeah, I do suspect that, and I thought the same when the campaign of violence began, which actually, if you remember, was shortly before the Ayatollah's murder and bounty threat in Pakistan. It was very noticeable that the people besieging the American buildings in Karachi were the sort of people who had just lost the election, the former Muslim extremists who'd been grouped around General Zia's dictatorship and who were looking for a way of regrouping and an issue with which to appeal to people. I think there's something of the same is happening in Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini has called for many holy wars lately, and he's called on people to martyr themselves for him in countless ways, and there are, I'm afraid to say, heaps of dead and numberless uncounted unknown graves as a result of his policy. I have the feeling that the willingness of his people to take him at his word and martyr themselves afresh is slackening. I think he knows that too, and I think therefore it's, in a sense, doubly incumbent on us not to give in to somebody who is in fact behaving out of desperation, who's at their weakest point, who's trying to prevent a reformation spreading to the Islamic world by its contact from the Enlightenment, who wants to stop that. I think we should be very forcible in resisting it and trying to turn the process the other way and to synthesize with the Islamic world certain ideas that they don't belong to Europe, they don't belong to America, they're common to humanity, that we call the ideas of the Enlightenment.
I should mention that before we go too far along, that in addition to being a columnist for The Nation, you're the author of a book of essays, Prepared for the Worst. What's in it?
Well, I'll tell you what's on it, which is on the dust jacket, I'm proud to say. There's a recommendation from Salman Rushdie that you buy and read it. And I hope this doesn't mean it's pulled from the shelves. But it's a collection of essays about the Reagan era, about Thomas Paine, the great Englishman who became also a great American, and who wrote The Crisis, and who, in a sense, contributed some of the finer amendments to the Constitution. So it's a general collection of essays in defense of the ideas of liberty, if I do say it myself. It might sound immodest, but...
you ought to mention out loud your country of origin.
Yes, in case anyone thought it was anywhere else, I was born in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I'm English. I've been living here for about 10 years now, but I'm told that the accent is still noticeable.
Before the next call, how do you think all of this will play out in terms of the viability of freedom of expression, let's say a year from today?
Well, my hope is that it's healthy, that this will in fact have confirmed people that it's a sort of exercise that's good for the muscles that have gone slack. We don't often have to, in our very own homes and malls and shopping centres, have to think, gosh, what's the price of free expression? I think it might be profoundly educational. I hope it doesn't turn into just defending ourselves against Islam or against the Ayatollah, because there are people always in all societies, and this one, who would like to tell us what they think it's okay for us to read, very often using religion as their excuse. And they deserve to be repudiated too, as they were in the past. It was necessary to repudiate them to have America, to have the American Revolution. So I'm optimistic if we can get through this, and if Salman is not hurt, if his isolation can be ended, and there's every chance I think that it can, I think it will have been good.
We've got about 20 minutes left with Christopher Hitchens. Next call for him. Orlando, Florida, you're on the air.
Yes, I'd like to speak about terrorism here. You know, we had the Dirty Dozen movies a few years ago. And why don't we send out all our criminals, except for child molesters and serial killers and all the real creeps, and send them out there and fight for us, because this is how our country started. This is how Australia started.
Tell you what, caller, do you have any comment you want to make about the issues surrounding the price on Salman Rushdie's head and the effect on...
Yeah, this man has a right to say what he wants to say, and publish a book or do anything he wants to do. We have this right in the United States, but people lie on the stand here in this country. They go out to courts and they see police officers lie.
Yes, ma'am, but I'd like you to make a comment regarding the very purpose of Christopher Hitchens' visit here today. Do you have a comment on that subject?
Yes, I do, because people have also a right to be honest. But honesty doesn't work, does it? It's proven all across the world that if you're honest, you're a victim.
All right, ma'am. Thank you very much. Comment?
Nothing immediate. No.
Washington, D.C. is next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I think that one of the most important elements here that it is not being talked about so much is the internal situation in Iran, which is the prime reason Khomeini has involved itself in this ridiculous show. I think in the past 6 months, Khomeini has killed somewhere around 12,000 of the opponents in Iran, and it is indeed because he doesn't have the issue of war anymore at hand. And I think that Khomeini is trying to use this issue to somehow divert the attentions from his really poor situation inside Iran. And the most interesting thing that I find in this whole episode is that this idea of, I think, moderates and hardliners are really ridiculous, and as long as Khomeini regime is in power, we're going to have the same sort of terrorism and ridiculous things under the name of Islam. I'm a Muslim, and I'm really opposed to this whole show, and I was wondering what's your opinion of this idea of moderate and hardliners?
Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's an admirable statement, and it may possibly have come from somebody tuned in late, because I had been saying earlier, sir, that I did think this campaign, both in Pakistan and in Iran, originated from political extremist conservative forces who felt their hold on the situation to be slackening. And I agree with what you say about that, especially in view of the fact that the Great Crusade, the Great Holy War, in which so many Iranians did lose their lives, is now over and hasn't come out as the Ayatollah wanted or predicted that it would. Of course you're right about the moderate business, and the earlier caller who asked me why I thought the US government had been so silent and rather shamefaced on the question, prompts me to give her another answer now. I think there is still in high circles in Washington a tremendous embarrassment about this absurd pretense that they were dealing with people who, though moderate, were extremist enough to deal only in weapons. And I dare say that people should blush about that. There are, indeed there have been some, I've had debates in public with Reaganites who, in a sense, defend the Ayatollah's position and say, of course he can campaign against blasphemy if he wants to. People like Pat Buchanan, who was Reagan's communications secretary at that point. But he, I think, was speaking, Buchanan, that's to say, as a religious extremist himself, and one who sees a solidarity between them that, overcomes denominations. That's why I began by attacking the statement made by John Cardinal O'Connor yesterday. But usually if you criticize a religious leader in America, you get people ringing up all the time, but no one yet.
Well, we've still got 14 minutes.
Okay.
But let me ask you, you told us what was in the book. You've read it. You want to offer your own critical view as to whether it's a good read? Is it a good novel? Good story?
Yeah, I did actually review it in print but in a small magazine about 2 weeks ago, and I said the following. Rushdie is a genius with language, but there's a difficulty which, if you're starting the book today, you should bear in mind. He's got an absolutely magnificent ear, and his ear is brilliant at catching the nuances and the tone of people who speak in Indian, Pakistani, subcontinental English. He's fantastically good at this. Makes almost poetry out of the prose. Unfortunately, that's not very well understood here as it is in England. There aren't that many people from the subcontinent in America. So the first couple of chapters may not strike you as being as funny as they really are, but I think by the third you may well be hooked. But do persist, and I think you'll also find that the remarks made about religion are all carefully judged remarks about dogma, about people who have automatic, unthinking faith. And no one who has any genuine devotional attachment to any religion could be offended.
Eugene, Oregon. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, if Rushdie is in fact killed, what response would you predict Britain or the United States to take, or what kind of action could they feasibly take?
There's no way of retaliating in kind, you see. It's the whole difference between our use of the word martyr or heretic and the use by fanatics of those words. When we say heretic, we quite often mean an honorable thing. Many of our greatest political and historical heroes have been people who were willing to brave the charge of heresy. The same with martyrdom. We say our faith as humanists doesn't require the creation of martyrs. We can't argue with people who appear to need to create them. We can't say we'll go and kill an Iranian scribe. That would be obscene, even if it was doable. I think I'm very reluctant to sort of answer the question without thinking about it very carefully, but what I think is this. If that happens, and I don't believe it will, because I think this is a dying regime and a fanatical, despairing maneuver on its part, but if a hair of his head is hurt, or if, and let it be forbidden, he should be killed, I think it would lead to an enormous revulsion in the Muslim world, which might in the long run contribute to the reformation that world so obviously needs. And I can't speak for Mr. Rushdie, but I think he hopes in any case that this controversy may help to bring that about.
Binghamton, New York. You're on the air.
Thank you. This is for Christopher Hitchens, and there's a couple points. In your first answer, you said, as I think basically everything I've read on the problem, is that blasphemy is not really happening. That is, it is the dream of a demented person. Now, my sense is very strongly, I'm not religious, it is, quote, blasphemy, unquote, in relation to a religious person. I think that most of the critics are kind of hiding and not coming forward. I think Rushdie himself I can understand that he will try to say it is not, but it is. It is a very heavy criticism. The second point is something that has not been brought up at all in discussion, it always remaining on the religious level, is that there is a wonderful subplot concerning the Imam sitting in Kensington, and going back, it is to a country called Daesh in the case of the book, but it is obviously Ayatollah is the image. Those two things, I think, are, if you have anything to say on that.
Well, you get a very good class of question from Binghamton, I must say.
Sunni at Binghamton.
Yeah, so I've been up there once, and I remember it's the same.
My hometown.
Yeah. It is? Oh, well. Blasphemy. Look, the word mahound is used in the novel. And mahound is, for those who haven't read this yet, an extremely abusive term leveled against the Prophet Muhammad by the Crusaders centuries ago, implying that he not just had failed to be the messenger of God, but that he was actually an emissary of the devil. Therefore, it's a tremendously, just to use the word is enough indeed to offend people who don't want to inquire any further. But the word is specially used in a way that satirizes its use. Salman says in the book, look, I use it just as so many other words began as terms of abuse. Impressionist, for example, began as a term of abuse for the school of painting that adopted it. Suffragette was a term of abuse for campaigners for women's rights. Black was a term of abuse at one point. The words Tory and Whig, political party names, both began as terms of abuse. People took the names on themselves as a way of drawing the sting, if you see what I mean, as a way of inverting them and turning them back as satirical, ironic weapons against the intolerant. That's what he's attempting to do. It's a very honorable enterprise. It's perfectly justifiable to try. And we could go even further into this, but I did also say at the beginning, and I do still insist, that if he had wanted simply to be offensive and to say this religion is nonsense as far as I can see, that's also his right.
Columbus, Georgia, you're on the air.
Yes, good evening. I was born and raised in the Middle East. I'm not Muslim, I'm a Christian. And it seems to me like the West really don't understand the Islamic word, period. I have a couple of things I'd like to mention. The Muslim word or the Arab word always looks at the West with suspicious, because the West never accepted the fact that Muhammad is the final word from God to mankind. The second thing, the Muslim leaders or the Muslim leadership, if it's in the Arab world or Iran or anywhere in the world, the Islamic world, use the scary tactics to scare their followers. And they rally their followers by scaring them or use religion for political motives, for their own benefits. I don't think really anything wrong with the Rushdie's book by expressing his opinion, but then you take the percentage of the educated people in that part of the world, the ones they read the book, they're very, very few. And the ones they read it probably couldn't understand it well, but they used it for their own benefits to manipulate the public opinion in their own countries to rally the support for the failing regimes like the Khomeinis and so forth. So I think, we have to look at their background, how they think and how they operate, and take actions according to their actions, not how we'd like to be judged, but how they judge us in the West, according to their standards, not our standards.
Okay, sir, thank you.
Yeah, good, fair observation. I mean, but I would strengthen a bit what you say about they haven't read it and may not have understood it, even if they have. They can't have read it. It's not available even in English in the Muslim world, and most people in the Muslim world speak either Arabic or Farsi or Urdu, and it hasn't been translated into any of those. And then you have to remember that, unfortunately, these regimes coexist with a very, very high level of illiteracy. Furthermore, and finally, there's a commandment that you don't read such books if you're told they're unclean or impure or blasphemous. So there are about 4 or 5 reasons why these people and their leaders cannot know what they're talking about. Now that, in a way, is what's frightening about this challenge, because it's a challenge that is proud of being ignorant, and thus one with which it's very difficult to compromise.
Los Angeles, California.
Yes, my concern is not necessarily with the First Amendment right, which we have and which we use freely. My concern is with the publishers and with the bookstores. And as an author, I was wondering if this gentleman could make any suggestions as to how we might apply pressure on those entities who, in fact, are really denying me my right by no longer publishing it and no longer selling it to buy it.
Caller, have you tried to buy the book?
Yes.
And what were you told?
It's not available.
You tried it in the chain stores?
Yes, sir.
What about independent stores?
No, I haven't.
Well, I think there's some good advice in yesterday's New York Times from someone with whom I almost never agree, though I admire him as a writer, William Southire, who says, go browse at B. Dalton and go browse at Walden Books and see what you want to buy, and then go to your nearest independent bookstore and spend your money there. That's the best way to punish them. It's a little extra trouble, but I think worth it, and it is the only language, currency that they understand. Then I think and hope we may hear soon from the PEN organization, which groups American authors and international writers, of some bankable, famous authors who will say they don't want their books sold in these chains too. There is talk of this. I mean, that's the most I know for now. But that, I think, would be a very fitting reply.
What's your response to the argument of the chain owners who say we're just trying to protect our employees and our customers?
Well, my response would honestly be that dues have to be paid. They make a good living out of the fact that we have freedom of speech. So do I. It's how I make my living. But I recognize that that doesn't come from the sky. It wasn't given me by God. It's the result of a willingness to sacrifice by people earlier on. The dues we're asking them to pay are not very great. They haven't been threatened, for one thing. There is no threat against the distribution of the book. The injunction does not apply to them. The injunction applies to the author and his publishers. So they're crying before they've been heard. Second, if they worry about security, deal with the security. But you don't make yourself any more secure by removing the book.
Silver Spring, Maryland. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about blasphemy or the Muslim mindset.
Oh.
What I really want to say is that this reminds me of the reaction we have. A lot of Americans sit around every time we have a book on the Holocaust, and they say, how did all those good Germans let it all happen? Well, it happens when we have a commission on pornography and Playboy and Penthouse disappear from 7-Eleven and Kmart. And then it happens with this kind of thing happening with the bookstores and the fear. And we're so self-righteous about other people who didn't stand up and be counted. And when we're asked to count, we turn tail and run so often, and freedom isn't going to last that way.
Thank you, Silver Spring.
Well put, but there are always people like yourself, madam, evidently, which is the encouraging thing. I mean, that's much more to the point. There are invariably people like the lady who just called who say, no, I'm not going to be treated like this. I'm not going to be told what to think. I will decide that for myself. And in the end, that idea is going to win because it's more democratic, it's more intelligent, it's more modern, it's more efficient to think like that than to be permanently under a mental cloud.
We've got enough time to talk more about the PEN organization and what their plans are. Are you a member?
I'm ashamed to say I'm not a member, but they've gained one member by this. It's another thing where I thought I'll pay the dues one day. I will now. What they're doing is tomorrow in New York City, and I believe today on the West Coast, holding public readings from the book with authors stepping to the microphone in relay, holding the book and reading from it and establishing the right for it not just to be written, but to be heard and read, which is part of the right. And that'll happen in New York City tomorrow morning at noon in the downtown gallery and will be carried, I think, on TV. I hope so. Everyone there will put their names to saying, we affirm this about the book, and then we'll see if anyone wants to add us all to the list. But I don't believe it. I think we have to face it and say this is a stupid, wicked bluff, and that there's no reason for anyone to act scared about this sort of intimidation.
Christopher Hitchens, columnist for The Nation and author of a book of essays, Prepared for the Worst. Is that in the stores now?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Now been pulled from the shelves?
As of this date, there probably are 2 more in the stores than I'd like. Out of the stores and onto the bookshelves of